Okay, good morning, everybody. Thanks for making it to the early session. We're going to be speaking now about ways and opportunities that you can hack all around you, all the time. With us this morning is Eleanor Saitta, speaking about playing with the built city. And at the end, we'll have about 10 minutes for questions. And just go to the mic on that side or that side. And Eleanor, if you could please repeat the question for the camera, that'd be great. And with that, I'll give you Eleanor, and please give her a very warm welcome.
Thanks. I'm going to be talking about what you can do to your city and why you might want to do it. How we know what changes are good, how we can evaluate the kinds of changes we might like to make to our cities, why we may want to intervene in our cities, what the other forces that are shaping our cities in ways that we may not like are, how to intervene, and I'll conclude with a bunch of examples of other ways that people have, or some theoretical examples of change in the city. So we're an urban species. As of the end of 2008, half of all people lived in cities. That number is supposed to hit 75% by 2050, possibly higher. Cities are huge conglomerations of wealth. They can't be anything else. They're power systems. They reproduce the socioeconomic hierarchies that create that wealth. Life in the city changes us. Cities define what you can do. They feed back into our actions every single day. They shape our desires. So we might not want that happening to us without any consent, without our say. So maybe we want to change our cities back. Maybe we don't like the way that our cities change us. We can find a lot of good things in cities. We find community, we find culture, we find friends, we find resources. But we also find this kind of totalizing schema of consumption and social alienation and hypernormativity and disengagement. And maybe that's not the city that we want to live in. So urbanism is political. It's necessarily political. The left and the right view those kinds of power structures very differently, and they react to them differently. So I'm not going to try to make this apolitical. We want to cause change so that our cities are more alive, so that they're more human, so that they're more enjoyable. This isn't the kind of criteria that a lot of cities are planned around. It's not that sort of efficiency-based, very capitalist criteria. But we want cities which live, which people can actually enjoy. We're acting necessarily outside control of the state, outside capital, which, again, makes this a political statement. But it's also the way that we as individuals can act on cities. So first I'm going to cover a few ways that you can understand the city. These are ways to think about the kind of change that you want in the city and evaluate those changes. The city that we see is different from the city that other people see. This is true for everyone. In Seattle, I live in an apartment, I go to a cafe, I have an office. These are all different than the fractions of the city that other people see. One person walks down the street by the cafe, another person walks down the street by the grocery store, even though they're walking down the same objective physical street. They have different mental maps and mental understandings of the city. That understanding is very powerful. The concept of the city as you understand it is called an imaginary. It's both a very concrete way that we navigate space, but also a cultural artifact. It has to do with how we imagine the city, how we understand the city, the emotional affect that spaces have on us. It's produced via cultural processes. We talk about our experiences in the city. We socialize. The city exists in song and music, in movies. All of those things create what the city is. Because we are not interacting directly with the factual city, but rather with this imaginary of the city, if we change that imaginary of the city, we change the city in a very real way, even if we haven't altered the city at any concrete level at all. That gives us a very powerful tool to change how we interact with the city. The notion of affordances comes from industrial design. Objects have properties that determine how you can use them. If you walk up to a door and it has a plate on it, you push on the plate to open the door. The concept of an affordance mismatch comes in when you push on the plate and the door doesn't open because you're actually supposed to pull on it. Or alternately, say there's a glass door, but you'd like to close it for privacy, but, and that's something that you normally do with doors, but this door doesn't actually support that. We can bring that concept of an affordance into urban design and look at affordances for life, the way the city affords us doing the things that we'd like to do in it. One good example is a bench at a bus stop. You might like to hang out on the bench and talk to friends and, have a sandwich or something, but that bench is designed so that you can only sit on it, and you have to kind of sit on the edge and keep it flipped down because they don't want people spending time there. You can make the bench more comfortable to sit on or use less materials, and that's still kind of in the urban design range, or in the industrial design range. As we get into urban design, we start looking at the context for that bench, and then we realize that, oh yeah, people do actually want to sit on this bench for a while, and maybe they get used as ad hoc bike racks, so we'd like to set it up so you can lock a bike to it without interfering with people who'd like to sit on the bench. Or we'd like to turn the bench so that instead of being directly facing into the traffic, so that it's only really useful as space to wait for the bus, you can look down the street, you're more engaged with the life of the sidewalk, you can actually use that as social space all of a sudden. So it's a very small change that can make that bench, can make that into a useful living environment. The lightness of space is a somewhat more obscure concept. It's originally due to Christopher Alexander. It's how well a space supports life in a way that is subjective but cross-culturally repeatable. If you put different people in different spaces, they will all have approximately the same idea of how human and how alive that space is. If you take 2 city squares as an example, one square is just flat asphalt. There's, no feature, nothing. Surrounded by buildings. There's kind of exits at each corner, but it's very precisely square and uniform and empty. That's a pretty dead space. If you take that same exact volume and maybe the building fronts are a bit skewed, the whole thing isn't perfectly square, it's cobblestones around the edges, there's a bit of a path, there's something in the center. All of a sudden, with very little actual change to the space, it becomes much more human and much more alive. If you put a set of tables and chairs in each square on a nice summer day, the square that is more alive will have more people in it because it's a space that people actually want to spend time in. An imaginary, a strong, positive kind of mental association with a space can help a space out, but in the end, if it's a dismal alleyway, no matter how storied of a dismal alleyway, people aren't going to want to spend time there. So you need to work on both the level of liveness or humanity and on the level of the imaginary. I'm going to move on to the kinds of forces that shape our cities. We have an idea, we have a way of evaluating actions now, but we need the context for our actions. We need to understand why cities take the forms they do. We're going to look first at the kind of macro-scale economic pressures that operate on cities, and then look a bit more at their concrete ramifications. Understanding these forces in their historical concept helps us get that kind of context that we need for actually working in cities. You can think of a city as being pretty directly defined by the economic activity that it supports. It supports that activity generates the city. People congregate there for a lot of reasons, but in order to live, they have to engage in that kind of activity. And that activity changes the shape of the city. In a Western capitalist, late capitalist society, that activity shapes the city more strongly than almost anything else. Capitalism forces all spaces to be valued. If you want to start a business, it has to justify itself by earning money. If you want to start a park, if you want to create a park, it gets forced into that same valuation schema. It's kind of unavoidable. If you're trying to do something which isn't